Hi, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome Jason Furman to the Maxwell School. As you know, Jason is the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Principal Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. I've known Jason for a while. I first got to know him when he was the head of the Hamilton Project, which is housed at Brookings, where I used to work. And for those of you who don't know it, the Hamilton Project is an extremely innovative and thoughtful project to look at creative solutions, bringing particularly the insights of good economics to bear on some of the big social and political challenges of our time, and has continued to do very exciting and important work. And Jason was an important force in helping create the impact that the Hamilton Project has had. And he preceded that with earlier service in the Clinton administration and a significant stint as a practicing economist as well, as a senior advisor to the chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank. And these are all very well-known features about Jason's career. But of course, we all, you could read that anywhere, so we all have to look up some stuff. So I looked up some stuff. The most important thing you should know is that, and the reason why Jason has been a great success is he's a social studies graduate from Harvard, I understand, which is always a good place to get started. And in the words of Bob Rubin, he is, quote, one of the few terrific economists who can also navigate politics, which is an extremely important skill in the job that he holds. But far important, and this may not be true, Jason, but it's in the public record, so you have to accept it's true. It is said that as a teenager he could juggle a bowling ball, an egg, and an apple all at once, or even flaming torches while astride a unicycle. Now, that is not something that very many of you can do, and certainly not something that I can do, or most practicing economists can do. So let me ask you to join me in welcoming Jason Furman.
So thanks for that introduction, and it's exciting to be here at the Maxwell School. Just over the years have encountered so many of your faculty, so many students that have come from here, read so much research that's come from here. It's such a stellar public policy school, and public policy schools are so important. I'd never actually seen it, and was thanks to Jim and Len for inviting me here, give me an opportunity to talk to some students earlier, and to all of you now. So wanted to just talk a little bit big picture about economic policy, about where things are right now, and then really discuss whatever it is you all most want to discuss. And today we are at a critical moment in American economic policy. And for 4 straight years, every single speech I've given or anyone else on the Obama economic team has began with, today we're at a critical moment in American economic policy. And we are all really looking forward to the point where we can give speeches that don't begin that way. But unfortunately, it's still true. When I started working for President Obama, it was on the campaign in Chicago. And in the beginning of that, what his biggest focus was on was the medium and long run structural problems facing our economy. He was worried about things like healthcare reform, energy and climate change, the squeeze on the middle class, inequality, financial regulation, what you could do to invest in infrastructure to support innovation, all of those types of things. And for the sake of this talk, I'll call all of that the structural growth agenda. And that's what really, on the economic side, excited him, motivated him, made him want to become president. But then something happened. And during the campaign, and even more intensely during the transition in our first few months in office, the immediate economic crisis was what really kept us up at night. It seemed bad to us when the summer of 2008, the Bureau of Labor Statistics said that we lost 65,000 jobs in 1 month. And then it seemed horrible when in November they said we lost 500,000 jobs. Well, those numbers were just their preliminary guesses as to what happened. They always go back and revise the data and make it more accurate. And it turned out when we thought we lost 65,000 jobs, that month over the summer, we'd really lost 200,000 jobs. And when we thought we had lost 500,000 jobs in November, we had lost over 800,000 jobs. Today, if you're looking at the most recent data, we now know something that we didn't even see in the, let alone predicting the future, in the actual data that the government was producing. We didn't see that the economy declined by 8.9% in the fourth quarter of 2008, that it was the worst decline in a 6-month period that the country has experienced since the Great Depression. And so this whole set of things, jobs, what was going on in financial markets, what was going on in housing, basically all came along and created another major new agenda item for the president, which wasn't on that original list, which is what I would call the immediate jobs agenda. Jobs was always an important part, but in a structural sense, but this was how to save the economy from a second Great Depression. So that was a second bucket of issues on the agenda. Finally, over the last 4 years, there's a third bucket of issues the president has consistently had to grapple with, and I'll call that the deficit agenda. And on that, before we came into office, in the previous 8 years, there had been trillions and trillions of dollars of unpaid for tax cuts, unpaid for entitlements, unpaid for discretionary spending, and that left us, together with the Great Recession, with a $1.2 trillion deficit the day the president walked in the door. And we've been grappling with the consequences of that deficit ever since. And so I think the story of economic policy making in the last 4 years is undoubtedly more complicated and nuanced, but to some degree it really is about the interplay between these three agendas. The structural growth agenda, which is ultimately the most important thing and what you want to get to and to do everything you need for growth and for shared growth. The jobs agenda, the immediate jobs agenda, which is just dealing with an economy in collapse and how to turn that around. And then finally, the deficit agenda. I think the good news is that all three of these issues are complementary, for the most part, economically. That's true of jobs and the deficit. We can't bring the deficit down without creating jobs and strengthening the economy. And conversely, if you take action to deal with the deficit over the medium and long term, that can help strengthen the economy today. It's also true of the longer run focus of the what I was calling the structural growth agenda, and the nearer term focus of the immediate jobs agenda. These are two of the most important, for example, just two of the most important future-oriented accomplishments of our first 4 years that none of you have ever heard of, were the president signed into law patent reform, and he signed into law something that would free up spectrum for mobile broadband. Both of those were part of the structural growth agenda. Both of those were about the medium and long term. But you talk to companies in the areas affected by that, and they'll tell you because they had more certainty for the future, they knew what to expect. In the case of patent reform, there'd be less litigation. It would actually lead them to invest more today and create jobs today. Again, the converse is true. For our long-run growth, we really need to invest in research. We really need to train workers. Two of the worst things that can happen to the amount of investment undertaken by companies or the amount of training that companies put into their workers are a contraction in the economy. So if you can create jobs, increase GDP growth, that will actually lead companies to invest more in research, invest more in training, and so that short-run investment can lead to a long-run gain. So I think these three things, the structural growth agenda, the immediate jobs agenda, and the deficit agenda, really can be very complementary economically. The bad news is they sometimes run up against each other politically, given the limited bandwidth that Congress has. So as much as possible, we try to integrate them together So for example, John Maynard Keynes will tell you you can create as many jobs digging a hole in the ground as doing anything else. When we did the Recovery Act, we thought rather than just digging a hole in the ground, you should maybe lay fiber optic cable in that ground, which was a broadband initiative the president had. And that fiber optic cable should be connected up to a doctor's office as part of an improvement in health information technology, which was the Health Information Technology initiative in the State of the Union. And it might share information about energy use through a smart grid, which is another initiative in the Recovery Act. And so, two things may be identical in terms of their short-run jobs impacts, digging a hole or digging a hole and putting fiber optic cable, but they can be vastly different in terms of their medium and long-run consequences. We've always tried to do that type of integration. So every round of deficit negotiations we've had with Speaker Boehner, from the summer of 2011 to most recently the fiscal cliff negotiations in December, the president's not just had deficit reduction in it, but has also had jobs. He's wanted and sought as part of those negotiations things like investments in infrastructure, extensions of unemployment insurance, which is important for the purchasing power associated with it, which can also help create jobs, and tried to integrate those. But you can't always integrate them. And there is no question that from, while we were dealing with the debt limit in 2011, and while some were willing to hold the economy hostage for the debt limit in 2011, that made it harder to focus on everything else you would want to do that's important to the economy. And that's what the president's trying to avoid now. We are very focused on the sequester, and I'll get back to that and what we'd like to do about it towards the end of this talk. But we're trying to make it really important and clear that the president isn't 24/7 the president of dealing with fiscal cliffs, and that's what he was elected to do, and that's his only job. He's also the president of immigration reform. He's also the president of gun safety. He's also the president of education, of infrastructure, of dealing with events around the world. And that's what he's doing. But again, a lot of those things, some of those things you can do without Congress. Most of the biggest things you need Congress. And that's where we've often had that type of tension and trade-offs between those different agendas. So, I want to now talk a little bit more, not at the meta level about what those three buckets are, but get into what's really in them. And I want to start with both the structural growth agenda and the immediate jobs agenda. But for that, I want to provide just a little bit of macroeconomic context before we get into it. So the other thing we're not allowed to give a speech without saying is that the economy's now enjoyed 35 straight months of job growth. It's 6.1 million private sector jobs. We change the numbers monthly. The sentence is largely the same, and that's real and that's meaningful. It's brought the unemployment rate down from about 10% to about 8%. It's about as quickly as we've seen unemployment rates fall really in the history of this country or around the world. But 8% is way too high, and it's a stark reminder of how much work we have left to do. In thinking about what that work we've done and what that work we have to do, it's really important to understand that this recession was different than a lot of previous recessions. Your typical recession, think what the United States went through in the early 1980s, which is the closest we've come to this in terms of unemployment rate, is actually usually a man-made recession, which is that the Federal Reserve is worried that inflation is too high. They raise interest rates. Because interest rates go up, people spend less buying houses. They spend less buying cars. Maybe businesses spend less investing. The economy goes into a recession. Inflation comes down. The Fed starts worrying about the recession. So they cut interest rates. And now there's all these people who haven't been buying many cars. They haven't been buying many houses. There's all this pent-up demand. They rush out and do it. And you get what's called a V-shaped recovery. And it's almost like an on-off switch. Here it was really different and much more challenging. One of the causes of the crisis we had was overbuilding of houses and a housing bubble. Well, you're not going to get out of that by people turning around and building a lot of houses. Houses was what drove most of our previous recoveries. It's not what has driven this one, although housing is now starting to heal and starting to grow. Consumers were really indebted and over-leveraged in the terminology going into this recession. You're not going to come right out of that with roaring consumer spending. You're going to have to work off some of your debt or raise some of your income and get those more in line with each other. And that type of prolonged period of dealing with overinvestment, dealing with bubbles, dealing with over-leveraging is something that a lot of countries around the world for centuries have experienced. And one of the best descriptions and analysis is to economists Carmen Reinhart and Vincent Reinhart, who document that in the decade following a financial crisis, a decade, 2018 would be a decade following this financial crisis, unemployment is significantly elevated, per capita GDP growth rates are significantly lowered, and the deleveraging still hasn't worked through the system. Now we're 5 years after, or almost exactly 5 years after the financial crisis turned particularly virulent, and unemployment remains elevated. Growth rates, generally, there's some bouncing around due to various factors, have been reasonably good, but we are still very much suffering from it and very much trying to climb out of it. If you look at how we've done a lot better than a lot of countries around the world have in dealing with it, and I think that's because we did very large things like the Recovery Act, like the financial rescue, like the efforts on housing. We've done a lot better than a lot of countries have historically. If you look at that Reinhart and Reinhart paper and compare the track record of countries around the world and their data set to what we've done a lot better. But grading on a curve, understandably, provides little comfort for Americans struggling to find a job, worried about their family incomes, or worried about their house, which is why no one's putting up a mission accomplished banner and why we're always trying to find more to do. So let me talk a little bit about what some of that more to do is. And the President in the State of the Union posed 3 questions. The first is, what can we do to make America a magnet for jobs? And he had a lot of parts to the answer. And some of them are short-run things, like invest in infrastructure or pass the remainder of the American Jobs Act that he proposed, which includes things like relief for teacher jobs. One of the things is the economy's been adding those 6.1 million jobs. States and localities have been subtracting jobs, the biggest source of subtraction being teachers. So that's something on the immediate jobs agenda you can do about. It doesn't take much of a stretch to understand saving a teacher's job today also helps our long-run growth. On the immediate jobs agenda, also is things like investments in clean energy, tax reform, which I'll come back to, especially on the corporate side, investments in technology and innovation, and then global things like in the State of the Union, the President announcing a trade agreement with the European Union, and one we have been working on with Pacific countries as well. So there's no question that jobs is the most immediate issue, and it's going to be an issue that's with us over the medium term, and it's going to be an issue with us over the long term. But as we look forward, we also need to ask a second question that the President posed in the State of the Union, and that is, how do we make sure workers have the skills for those jobs? And there's a lot of different ingredients to that. One of the ones that's a new initiative we have that we're really excited about is universal preschool. There's some states that do this quite well right now, like Oklahoma, parts of Georgia. And what we'd like to do is set up a new federal way to assist all of the states in developing high-quality preschools for 3- and 4-year-olds, ones that would be free for low and moderate-income households, and then sliding scale with incomes above that. There's evidence that you get a $7 return for every dollar you put in it. Most of that return is not going to show up in the unemployment rate, tomorrow or the next day. To the degree it shows up in any economic data, it's going to show up 20, 30, 40 years from now as those children go on to school, graduate from school, and enter in the workforce. That's obviously not a reason not to do it. It might explain why we're coming to it now and didn't do it, try to get it done in January of 2009. That skills agenda and education agenda includes everything, K through 12, race to the top, college completion, training, how to reform our training program. So right now, if you lose your job because your factory closes, you go to training office and they ask you why your factory closed, and you say, like, I don't care why my factory closed. I don't have a job. I need training. And they're like, well, why did it close? If it closed for training, for trade reasons, you go here and get this. If it didn't, you go there and get that. And things like that don't make any sense, and we've had some reforms to consolidate those and invest more. The final question the president posed in the State of the Union was responding to a really deep long-term trend of rising inequality we have in this country, in the top 1% or 1/10 of 1% of the highest share income they've had since the 1920s. And so that question was, how do we make sure that everyone shares in the growth? Part of the answer to that is jobs. Inequality is reduced if a bunch of people who are making zero because they don't have a job get a job and are making $15, $20, $40, $50, $100,000. Part of that answer is education, because one of the things that's driven inequality is the mismatch between the growth rate of skilled workers and the demands of the technologies that use those workers. And by addressing that mismatch, you'd reduce that inequality. But there's probably a bunch of other things that one needs to do more directly. So things like the President in the State of the Union calling to raise the minimum wage to $9 an hour, calling for new programs to go into our poorest communities and help lift them up, calling for continuing tax credits for low-income households and the like, all of which are an important part of that. So those are some of the things in the long-term growth agenda, the immediate jobs agenda, and wanted to now get to the deficit agenda. And the deficit is the one that is a really important economic issue. It matters for our growth. It matters for our country's future. It matters for, Jim could tell us, national security and other things. It's also been the one that has been the most successful, shall we say, at thrusting itself onto the agenda and onto the center of the agenda, largely because of a series of cliffs and this and that have forced everyone to come together and work on the issue. On the deficit, I wanted to make three general points. The first, which I think is really underappreciated, is we have made and are continuing to make enormous progress in dealing with our deficit. The deficit was 10% of GDP when we come into office. In the last 4 years, it's fallen by nearly 5 percentage points. That is the largest decline in the deficit that this country has ever seen in a 4-year period, with the exception of the demobilization from World War II. And it's actually at a similar pace to what you see in countries like the UK that are widely known and associated for what they've done. I'm looking for my water. Famous recent incident. Also Poland Spring. What they've done on the deficit. So we've brought it down really quickly. And you look at the projections for the next 2 years, and even if we do nothing, it's going to come down by another about 3 percentage points of GDP, which is about as rapid a 2-year deficit reduction as we've seen. Partly this is because of economic growth, and the economy coming out of the recession brings the deficit down. And partly it's because the president has already signed into law more than $2.5 trillion of deficit reduction over the next decade. He put caps on discretionary spending, but cut it to the lowest as a share of the economy since Eisenhower. And then just recently raised tax rates for high-income households. And those two steps together, plus the interest you save, is $2.5 trillion. So we've made this enormous progress, and we're cutting the deficit very rapidly. We don't need to cut it that much more rapidly. We don't need a lot more deficit reduction in 2013 when we're already at basically the record for the United States in terms of the pace of deficit reduction. What we need is more deficit reduction in the medium term and in the long term. Brings me to my second point. Not going to end on we've made great progress, we're done, unfurl that mission accomplished banner. Obviously, we continue to have a very significant medium and long run deficit challenge. Even after the economy fully recovers, even after all of the deficit reduction measures we've put in place go fully into effect, the deficit would still be above about 4% of GDP. And the reason you care is above 4% of GDP, the debt as a share of the economy is growing. And a debt as a share of the economy growing is obviously unsustainable. The goal we've generally had in this administration is bringing deficits below 3% of GDP. That's below their historical average. And more importantly, that works out to be, given other economic variables, about what you need for the debt to be falling as a share of the economy. And you can argue, what rate you want it to fall, where you want it to end up. But as long as it's falling, you know you're going in the right direction, and you are in a generally sustainable position. So there's a bunch more we need to do over the medium to long term. Our numbers, and a lot of other people have come to similar numbers, are you need about at least $1.5 trillion of additional deficit reduction on top of what we've already done in order to get that deficit under 3% of GDP and get that debt declining. And so that brings me to my third point, which is our basic approach to that is that it should be done in a balanced way. And there's three important components of balance. One is, which I've already talked about, is we don't need a lot of deficit reduction to happen and take effect in the year 2013. We've already brought our deficit, we're already bringing it down quickly. We need a lot in the medium and long term. The second test of balance is a balance in terms of what you're cutting. We shouldn't be cutting education and infrastructure. In fact, we should be investing in education and infrastructure. But there are areas like Medicare where there's still a lot of ways that we can bring down the cost of health care, make that program more cost effective, and reduce the deficit. And then the third part of balance is we don't see a way to satisfy those first two tests of balance and do it entirely on the spending side of the ledger. We don't see $1.5 trillion of spending cuts that are consistent with the types of investments that we need in growth, the types of things we need to make sure that people are included in the benefits of that growth. And so need a balance of spending and revenue. And I'll get in a moment to what the president has on the table to that end. But that's the basic approach the president has. What undoubtedly fails that approach is the sequester. The sequester does a lot of cuts right now this year and doesn't actually do a lot for the long-run deficit. In fact, it ends after 9 years, so it technically does nothing for the long-run deficit. It fails the test of balance in terms of what it cuts. It cuts education and infrastructure very heavily. It also cuts national defense more heavily than we should be cutting it. And at the same time, it actually doesn't have very much in the way of savings in Medicare. And the savings it has aren't the types of reforms that would bring down the cost of Medicare, grow in the long run, and really be the types of structural entitlement reforms we've seen. And the sequester obviously doesn't have any revenue. All of that was because the sequester was designed to motivate action, not be a substitute for action. It was meant to make life unpleasant for us. It was meant to make life unpleasant for Republicans, and it was meant to bring everyone to the table to agree on something that was balanced. In terms of what we have on the table right now, we made an offer in our back and forth negotiations with Speaker Boehner in December, before he broke them off, that we were willing to do a certain amount of spending, a certain amount of revenue. President has been crystal clear that that offer remains on the table. There's a lot of people who would have said, you know, you won the debate on taxes, you got no spending cuts, you got all revenue. A lot of people say Republicans have gone back to their corner, they've taken revenue off the table, you have to go back to your corner. That wasn't the president's attitude. His attitude was, I made an offer, I made it in good faith, and I'm not going to try to squeeze every little tiny inch of, you know, whatever out. I'm not going to retreat to my corner and be positional. I thought it was good for the economy. I thought it was reasonable, and I'm going to stand by it. What it consists of is $900 billion of spending cuts and $600 billion of revenue. In addition, you get interest savings, so you'd actually get about $1.8 trillion of deficit reduction. So you'd get that deficit down as a share of GDP, that debt declining as a share of GDP. About half of those, nearly half of those savings would come from health care. And those Medicare reforms are actually the same amount as what Bowles-Simpson proposed. If Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission in the last year grow more quickly than Bowles-Simpson over the long run. You get you know, tough entitlement things like the chain CPI, which wasn't our first choice of switching to a new way of measuring inflation, which would affect all federal programs and the tax code that are indexed. But it was something the president was willing to do as part of a balanced agreement because it was important to the Republicans we were working with. It includes some other entitlement changes and some additional balanced discretionary cuts between defense and non-defense. On the revenue side, it's would all be achieved through tax reform. The debate over tax rates is over, and the president wants to get the bulk of this money from reducing some of the so-called tax expenditures that Len has been a very big, well, champion is the wrong word, opponent, wrestling with for decades, educating all of us about them. And there's a lot of money in them, as he has helped educate all of us. And reducing those tax expenditures could get you that $600 billion. In addition, we'd love to do a broader tax reform. And certainly economically, we think the more promising part of that reform is probably on corporate taxes, where there is scope to reduce the rate. We've proposed 28%, reduce it quite substantially, reform things like our international tax system, and deal with a lot of the loopholes and complexities and things that distort investment into unproductive directions. And then there's also scope on the individual side, especially for simplification, for having the tax system do less to you know, distort certain incentives, and to make the tax system fairer. So from our perspective, that would be, you know, a really great thing in terms of the deficit. You'd be able to do some things for growth like infrastructure. You'd be able to have a lower corporate tax rate. You'd be able to have serious Medicare reform. You'd be willing to do things like the chain CPI. It is just a much more attractive route for the country than the sequester. We have 1 week till the sequester starts. You all have, I suspect, enough expertise in Washington to know that 1 week is probably not enough to do everything I just said. So what we're trying to do now is just give ourselves a little bit more time by using some much smaller combination of revenue and spending to pay to delay the sequester for enough time so that you could negotiate something like this bigger agreement. The biggest impediment we faced is that our Republican friends, one, have gotten more enthusiastic about the sequester than they used to be. And hopefully at some point, you know, you can point out that, you know, the sequester has really heavy cuts in defense and very little in Medicare. The proposal we're offering would actually have very significant Medicare reforms and much smaller cuts to defense than the sequester would have had. So in a lot of ways should be more attractive. And the sequester doesn't reform the tax code. It doesn't bring down the corporate tax rate. It doesn't do anything to make America more competitive. So we think it is a much better path. But as I said, that's one impediment in the debate, has been just deciding, hey, this sequester is a decent way to cut spending, and just trying to point out how stupid a way of cutting spending it is. And then the second obstacle, obviously, is the question of revenue. And Speaker Boehner had offered $1 trillion. He's passed $600 billion. It'd be perfectly reasonable if he wanted to say there's 400 left, so I still have 400 on the table. That's the way the president's approached it. Unfortunately, you've heard more. They got their revenues over, and the number is 0. So it's a world where revenue is sort of a binary thing. The president got like a little notch in his belt. He got a victory. He got revenue. You were done, as opposed to the reason you wanted revenue is you wanted to get a certain amount of deficit reduction. And $600 billion helped, but $600 billion wasn't as much as we need. And so it's really the amount. And so even reiterating the same amount that as recently as 2 months ago he was in favor of would be a great contribution to the debate. Unfortunately, it's a contribution that we haven't seen. So we're going to continue to go forward and educate people about the damage the sequester does, educate people about how there's a better path, and educate people about how reasonable it is to do with a balance of spending and revenue. But at the same time that we're doing all of that, we're going to be continuing to push forward the rest of that structural growth agenda, the rest of that immediate jobs agenda, and then a broader set of issues around gun safety. And President is, I think all presidents, and this president is extremely good at doing a lot of things at the same time and keeping a lot of balls in the air, to borrow from Jim's introduction. And we have no choice but to do that, given all the challenges we face. So I am happy to discuss now really any aspect of economic policy and the issues I brought up. But if you want to talk about how policy making works in Washington or doesn't work in Washington, or experiences or things like that, happy to talk about them as well. So. Does that work? Okay. I think there was a rather tall person over there.
I'm Furman, Syracuse University. One thing, a lot of the issues you talked about are really contentious, or huge disagreements between Republicans and Democrats. One thing, listening to State of the Union and your talk, made me think there was an area where there could be agreement, is preschool, community colleges, training for jobs. It seems to fit into the Republicans' opportunity agenda, equalizing opportunity rather than outcomes. And yet the response to that was, you're just talking about big government and more spending. Is there any way you can see you could actually, it seems like that would be a natural area where you could reach a bipartisan agreement if,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, let me add one or two other areas to that and then get back to that one. I remember one day in November, we brought a bunch of CEOs into the Roosevelt Room to meet with the president on the fiscal cliff and to talk about it, and I was sitting there with him. And they were all going on and on about how important it was to invest in America's infrastructure. And they used even certain language like infrastructure bank and leverage and blah, blah, blah. Across the street in the old executive office building where the vice president's ceremonial office, he had a meeting with all the labor union presidents. And I sort of ran straight from one to the other to join the vice president for that meeting. And I heard the labor leaders talk about infrastructure in exactly the same words. And it was not just infrastructure, but infrastructure bank and leverage and the same types of things. And there's one particular proposal for an infrastructure bank that the Chamber of Commerce and the president of the AFL-CIO stood next to each other when the proposal was unveiled in Congress 2 years ago. And then at the signing, oh wait, we haven't had the signing ceremony because for some reason, even when business and labor can agree on an eminently sensible idea, it doesn't automatically happen. But infrastructure is an area like that. Immigration is an area where there's not, there's a lot of agreement between the two parties. And then I think the third area, and this was actually the other one where you heard it from both business and labor, was education. And in both of those rooms, that was the other issue you heard from both of them. So that would seem like an area of common ground. And I don't know, partly, I mean, it's sort of a boring cliche, but the polarization in Washington is one issue. There may be a little bit of not wanting to give the president victories, but we're happy to call it like the John Boehner preschool program. I mean, it's not, and if his popularity goes up, 20 points, that's fine if everyone gets preschool as a result of it. So he's never been that focused on that, and some of it I think will happen too. Immigration, a year ago, I think most people had written it off. I think the prognosis for that is much better now. Infrastructure, we've gotten some things done on a bipartisan basis, but I think it feels like it's getting readier. And part of why the president wants to articulate this vision is to put something like preschool in that same position. It's also the case, by the way, that in divided government, part of how you get things done is trades. So if you look at the big deficit reduction in 1990 and 1997, both of which were bipartisan, that's where key things that Democrats and Republicans both wanted to get done that weren't just deficit reduction got done. So things like the Hope tax credit for college that you personally love so much. President Clinton wanted to get that done. How do you get that done in divided government? Republicans don't like it. Well, you do a trade and put it as part of a bigger package. So, we'll look for opportunities in the broader fiscal setting to do these types of things as well.
Question?
Yeah.
Yeah, you talked a bit about inequality, and in the last 4 years, you've seen, I think it was maybe last year, the Fortune 500 companies have never had higher profits, and that largely this has been built off of increased productivity, mergers and acquisitions. It hasn't been about creating jobs and creating more output. And I'm wondering if this uncertainty, this focus on crisis, government in crisis and uncertainty is actually to the benefit of business in a sense that it allows them to put the onus of distributed economic growth on someone else. And they can say, well, I don't know what's going to happen with the payroll tax. I don't know what's going to happen with this tax. I don't know what's going to happen with Obama getting reelected. So I don't have to move forward now. I can just keep taking those profits. And if you think that's true, that it is to the benefit to have this crisis, this continual uncertainty, what are the political implications for that? How do you make policy if a large moneyed constituency is saying, well, wait a minute, we got to think about that, and let's put off, the fiscal cliff got put off to the sequester and so on and so forth. So politics-wise, how do you go about making policy and finding agreement when one side may not want agreement at all?
Mm-hmm. So I think, I think I disagree with the premise of your question, so let me explain how I'd see it. I think uncertainty is just bad for all of us. You can debate the magnitude of how bad it is and how significant a factor it's been in the economy, but I think it's nothing but bad. And I think that companies don't create jobs because they're altruistic or are serving some public service nonprofit goal. Companies create jobs because they think it will make more of a profit for them. And the vast bulk of the 150 million jobs we have in America today are there because somebody thought that by creating that job, they would make more money. And this uncertainty has in some cases led some of those companies to think, you know what, if I hire that person, maybe I'll have something to sell tomorrow, but what about 6 months from now if I don't have something to sell, and then maybe I can't fire them, or I've paid some fixed cost to bring them on, or I'll have to pay their co-brel, whatever it is. and it makes them more reluctant to hire. We could argue whether businesses are making the right business choice or the wrong business choice. Are they rational for sitting on over $1 trillion of cash, or sort of are they missing some profit opportunities? But I don't think they're sitting there thinking, wouldn't it be great if we could be deterred from hiring people so that we'll accumulate that cash? Companies love to take their cash and invest it in new things that will make even more money, or hire people that will make even more money. And they just haven't seen as much opportunity for that as you'd like. So I think certainly part of that solution to all of that cash would be more certainty. Part of that solution would be just more aggregate demand. I mean, part of why we've done all these things to help increase purchasing power of things in the past, like the payroll tax cut, why we thought extending unemployment insurance was so important, is that'll lead people to go out and buy stuff. And you buy stuff from people that sell it, or that make it, or that transport it, or that keep track of it, or what have you. And that will make companies, want to hire more of those people. Yeah, so I don't think there's any good argument for uncertainty, and and I think may not agree with everything corporate America wants on every issue, but they were good in November and December about pushing for a balanced approach to the deficit. I mean, they came to us and said you need to do entitlements and taxes. They went to Republicans and said it, and a lot of Republicans were not very thrilled to hear that message from some of the nation's leading CEOs. The tax rates needed to go up, and those leading CEOs did say that.
So is it, just last question, is it to convince them to reinvest those profits to where it would create growth rather than hold it? Is it creating policy to encourage reinvestment of those profits into their own growth rather than just holding on to it as a reserve?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think aggregate demand would help with that. More aggregate demand would help. More certainty would help with that. Maybe there's some other factors we don't fully understand, but we'd love to see them, investing more of that cash and hiring more people. And and I genuinely think they'd love to do that too. Businesses like to expand. I mean, that's why something like the debt limit, for example. Also, it's another good example. Debt limit. The reason that Speaker Boehner backed off his "you need to do it dollar for dollar" and passed a clean debt limit was in part that he had zero support from the business community. All of them were like, don't put the country through this again. When we did it in summer 2011, we had the worst job creation month in the whole recovery, was August of 2011, and the debt limit and all the uncertainty around it definitely played a role in that. And no one in the business community wanted to see a repeat of that. No one really in America wanted to see a repeat of that. As a result, that message actually did get through, and we didn't have a repeat of it this time around on the debt limit.
Do you think that that the break that occurred between Boehner and Cantor during the fiscal cliff negotiations is significant when discussing the ability to get economic legislation through Congress, and also just further implications for bipartisan talks?
There's no question that Speaker Boehner has a very hard job. I think he was, was in the room directly with him for a lot of negotiations and spent a lot of time with his staff. And I think they were genuinely motivated in the summer of 2011 to reach an agreement. I think they were genuinely motivated, as recently as mid-December 2012 to reach an agreement. And something happened. We've seen him pull out of these talks and not have the support, not know, either have it or know how to marshal it, from his troops. And I don't know which personalities are doing what and how the internal dynamics are, but there's no question that would love a negotiating partner who is committed to that negotiation and who has the support they need to go into that negotiation. And had we reached those deals in the summer 2011, or the big deal we're looking for in December 2012, there would have been a lot of Democrats that didn't like it. The president would have had to make a really big effort to sell those agreements to his caucus and Democrats in the Senate and in the House. And that's what you need everyone to be willing and have the power to do. So,
I want to ask you about trade. There's obviously been a long-standing debate about the impact of trade on jobs, both on the aggregate number of jobs and the distribution of jobs. And there's been a fair amount of recent research kind of re-triggering that debate, suggesting that maybe part of the problem in the answer to the president's third question about the middle class is associated with trade. Now, obviously, the specific trade agreements that the president is proposing, especially with the EU, may pose less problems because you're dealing with another trade partner that has high labor standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you assess the relationship between the trade agenda and this middle class reinvigoration agenda? And what, how does you and the president think about the strategy of relating the trade agenda and then selling it as a part of sustaining the middle class?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question, and and part of what you were alluding to, just for the benefit of everyone else, is a recent paper by excellent economist led by David Otter at MIT and two others, who reassessed trade with China. And these are people that do exactly what research should be about, which is don't come to it with a strong prior bias and torture the data until you get it there, but try to actually look at what the data says. And they found that there were much larger costs associated with the job loss associated with trade with China over, I think, the last decade or so, as I believe the time period, than a lot of economists had previously thought. Now, one paper doesn't make something automatically true, but it certainly is one very good paper and one careful paper and one that one suspects is unbiased. And I think that does pose an important challenge for us. As you said, some things like the EU, you don't worry about that as much, and I think there's a reason why that's less controversial than some of the other things we've done on trade. And it's nice because it's a high ratio of consequential importance to the economy to controversy. Some of our other trade agreements that we've done may have been very important for foreign policy. They weren't, but they had high levels of controversy relative to the actual number of jobs or growth or anything at stake for our economy. So I think that's why it's great that the president's focusing on things that really matter. Some of it is how you do that trade. Are you dealing with how countries deal with their intellectual property? Is a major challenge we face with China, for example. Some of it is what we're doing here, what we're doing to, if you have a challenge in manufacturing, one answer could be what you do on trade, another answer could be, cut your corporate tax base, rate and broaden your corporate tax base. So it informs your domestic policies, but I think the most honest people really do grapple with this question, as opposed to just dogmatically, say all trade is great and perfect, and we just need more of every single type at all times, or all trade is terrible and horrible, and do try to look at the data and change their minds and figure out in a thoughtful way what you can do about it.
The New York Times called you a centrist, and I was wondering, how do you deal with such highly contested topics such as like debt reduction and tax structure between the two parties?
So, I was saying this to a few people I was talking to before. I think I'm like staff in the White House, and so to some degree, to a large degree, my own views don't matter very much and shouldn't matter very much. Part of what we try to do, and it sounds naive, but it's really true, is help people make decisions, figure out what the different options are, what the pros and cons of those options are, what the evidence for the different sides is. I'll often argue for A versus B, but an important part of my job is making sure that B is on the table and fairly represented, and if that's what the president wants to do, that's what we do. So I think when you read the journalistic accounts of the first few years of the presidency on the economic team or the foreign policy team or what have you. You know, it's very much like this personality versus that personality and what have you. You know, and there's certainly some of that, of course, with some of that. But there's a lot of collective problem solving, and a lot of those accounts miss things. You know, you can read about what size the Recovery Act was because of some memo Romer did or didn't write or something like that. And you miss the big picture that we did a much larger fiscal expansion than European countries did. So the sort of big thing to explain is why we basically got it right by doing a large fiscal expansion. And you know, if you were sort of a cross-national political scientist, you'd think that was the puzzle. Why did we do so large? And whatever study you did probably wouldn't even mention, you know, Christy Romer or Larry Summers or Peter Orszag, and you'd capture a lot. So, but the other thing, and again, I was saying before this, is I think it helps a lot to understand other people's arguments, even if you think they're wrong. If you're going to do a job that is a staff job. We had someone we hired once who was really brilliant, and you'd say, hey, what do you think we should do? And they'd tell you, and then you'd say, well, what are the best arguments against that? They'd be like, what do you mean we should do it? You'd be like, well, what are the best arguments against it? But it's the best thing to do. Well, what are like 2 other options and pros and cons, and then we can figure out if we really want to do that. Why would you want other options? That one's the best. You know, someone that has that mentality, there's like great roles for them to play in our society. There may even be like parts of the government where they have a great role to play. They don't have a great role to play in, you know, the National Economic Council in the White House, where part of what we try to do is make sure you know, you bring those options, bring the pros and cons, and can see different sides. Same thing in a negotiation. You know, we had this refundable tax credit called Making Work Pay in the Recovery Act, which we loved. Republicans hate refundable tax credits. It's useful to sort of understand their perspective on it to figure out how to craft the solution. In this case, the solution was, rather than continuing it, switch over to a payroll tax cut, which didn't have a refundable component and got money to low-income people just like we wanted. So you get what you want, get what they want, and sort of understand what everyone wants. And, you know, may not agree with it, but maybe you can persuade people. Often you can't. You can figure out something that minimizes their concern while maximizing what you want. And for that, it helps to be pragmatic.
Great. Well, it's fantastic. Thank you all for coming. It's a great, not only a great explication of the substantive policy, but I especially like the last point, which I think is extremely useful and valuable insight for our students here. So thank you very much.